I never thought a snowstorm would turn me into a neighborhood villain. But that's exactly what happened when Brenda Holloway decided my snow-clearing technique violated HOA Code Section 12.4. My name is Scott Anderson, and I've lived in the Riverside Meadows community in Rochester, Minnesota for 3 years. It's one of those picture-perfect suburban developments where every house looks nearly identical. The lawns are manicured to within an inch of their lives, and the HOA board treats the rule book like it's the Constitution. I moved here after my divorce, thinking a quiet neighborhood would be exactly what I needed to rebuild my life. I work as an electrical engineer at a manufacturing plant, and I just wanted somewhere peaceful to come home to after long shifts. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late January. Minnesota winters are brutal, and we'd just gotten hammered with 18 inches of snow overnight. I woke up at 5 in the morning, knowing I'd need to clear my driveway before heading to work. I grabbed my snow blower from the garage, fired it up, and got to work. The machine was a beast, a 2-stage Ariens I'd bought specifically for these kinds of storms. It chewed through the snow like it was nothing, throwing it in a perfect arc to the side of my driveway. Now, here's where things get interesting. My driveway slopes slightly toward the street, and the most efficient way to clear it is to blow the snow toward the right side, where there's a natural drainage area between my property and my neighbors. I'd been doing it this way since I moved in, and nobody had ever said a word about it. The snow landed in a spot where it didn't block anything, didn't interfere with anyone's property, and melted away naturally when the weather warmed up. I finished clearing my driveway, swept off my car, and headed to work feeling pretty good about myself. I'd conquered the snowstorm, I'd be on time for my shift, and I'd even managed to clear a path to my mailbox, which sat at the end of my driveway near the street. The postal service in our area is strict about accessibility. If they can't reach your mailbox, you don't get your mail. It's that simple. That evening, when I got home from work, there was an envelope taped to my front door. It was from the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, and my stomach sank the moment I saw it. Nothing good ever came from the HOA. I tore it open and read the contents, my blood pressure rising with each word. Dear Mr. Anderson, it has come to our attention that you violated HOA Code Section 12.4 on the morning of January 23rd. You improperly cleared snow from your driveway in a manner that creates an aesthetic disruption to the community. According to our guidelines, all snow must be distributed evenly across your front lawn and not concentrated in any single area. Your violation has resulted in a fine of $150, which must be paid within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties. Sincerely, Brenda Holloway, HOA President. I read the letter 3 times, certain I must be missing something. Aesthetic disruption. I'd cleared my driveway the same way for 3 years. The snow wasn't on anyone else's property. It wasn't blocking anything. It was literally just sitting in a pile in a drainage area that existed specifically to handle excess water and snow. I pulled out my copy of the HOA regulations, which I kept in a drawer in my kitchen. Every homeowner gets one when they buy a property in Riverside Meadows, and I'd read through it when I first moved in, though I'll admit I hadn't looked at it much since. I flipped to section 12.4 and found the relevant passage. All snow removal must be conducted in a manner that maintains the aesthetic integrity of the community. Snow should be distributed evenly across the property owner's lawn and not piled in a manner that creates visual disruption or impedes drainage systems. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. The rule was vague at best, and I'd argue my snow removal didn't violate it at all. The drainage area was designed to handle snow and water. I wasn't creating any disruption. But more importantly, this rule had never been enforced before. I'd watched my neighbors clear their driveways in all sorts of ways, and nobody had ever gotten fined for it. I decided to call Brenda directly. I'd met her a few times at community meetings, though I usually tried to avoid those gatherings. She was exactly what you'd expect from an HOA president. A middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive athleisure wear, and an air of authority that suggested she took her position very seriously. She answered on the third ring. Brenda Holloway speaking. Hi, Brenda. This is Scott Anderson from 42 Maple Drive. I got a letter from the HOA today about a snow removal violation, and I'm hoping we can talk about it. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her settling into her chair, preparing for battle. Yes, Mr. Anderson. I issued that notice myself. I drove past your property this morning and observed the violation. I'm confused about what exactly I did wrong. I cleared my snow the same way I always do, and it's not blocking anything or causing any problems. The problem, Mr. Anderson, is that you created an unsightly pile of snow in your side yard. It's visible from the street and detracts from the community's appearance. The regulations are very clear about this. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm. Brenda, that area is a drainage zone. It's designed to handle snow and water runoff. I've been clearing my driveway this way for 3 years. Just because you've been doing something incorrectly for 3 years doesn't make it right. The board has decided to enforce this regulation more strictly this winter. We've had complaints from residents about unsightly snow piles, and we're taking action. Who complained about my snow pile? That information is confidential. Now, if you'd like to appeal the fine, you can submit a written request to the board and we'll schedule a hearing. But I should tell you that the board stands behind my decision. I felt my frustration building. This seems ridiculous, Brenda. I'm just trying to clear my driveway so I can get to work. Then I suggest you clear it in accordance with HOA regulations. The fine stands, Mr. Anderson. Have a good evening. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. $150 for clearing snow in a perfectly reasonable way. It was absurd. Over the next few days, I asked around the neighborhood, trying to figure out if anyone else had gotten similar fines. My neighbor to the left, Tom Brennan, was a friendly guy in his 60s who'd lived in Riverside Meadows since the development was built. I caught him checking his mail one evening and asked if he'd heard anything about the HOA cracking down on snow removal. "Oh yeah," Tom said, shaking his head. "Brenda's on a rampage this winter. She fined the Martins for having their Christmas lights up too long, and she sent a warning to the Chens about their garbage cans being visible from the street. She's been HOA president for 2 years now, and every year she gets more intense about the rules." "Did you get fined for snow removal?" "Nope, but I've got a snowplow service that comes through. They pile all the snow on my lawn, spread it around real nice. Costs me a fortune, but I don't have to deal with the hassle." That night, I decided to file an appeal. I wrote a detailed letter explaining my position, included photos of my property showing that the snow wasn't causing any problems, and cited the vague language of the regulation. I submitted it through the HOA's online portal and waited for a response. 2 weeks later, I got a letter scheduling a hearing for the following Monday evening at 7 o'clock at the community center. I'd have 15 minutes to present my case to the board, after which they'd make a decision. The community center was a bland, single-story building at the entrance to Riverside Meadows. It had a meeting room, a small gym, and a kitchen that got used for neighborhood events. I arrived at 6:55, dressed in business casual attire, carrying a folder with my documentation. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the 5 board members sat, and rows of chairs facing them. A few other residents were scattered around the room, probably there for their own hearings or just to watch the proceedings. Brenda sat in the center of the table, flanked by the other board members. To her right was Gerald Patterson, the vice president, a stern-looking man in his 50s who owned a car dealership. To her left was Linda Kowalski, the treasurer, a woman in her 40s who worked as an accountant. The other 2 members were David French and Margaret Ellis, both retirees who seemed to spend most of their time volunteering for various community activities. Brenda called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock. There were 2 other cases before mine. A couple who'd painted their front door without getting approval from the Architectural Review Committee, and a guy who'd installed a basketball hoop in his driveway that apparently violated height restrictions. Both cases were dispatched quickly, with the board upholding the violations and the fines. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front of the room and set my folder on the small podium that had been set up. "Mr. Anderson," Brenda said, her voice formal and detached. "You have 15 minutes to present your appeal of the snow removal violation issued on January 23rd. Please proceed." I opened my folder and pulled out the photos I'd printed. "Thank you. I'm here to appeal the fine because I believe it's based on a misunderstanding of both the HOA regulations and the actual situation on my property. First, let me show you these photos. This is the area where I placed the snow after clearing my driveway. As you can see, it's a natural drainage area between my property and my neighbors. The snow isn't blocking any walkways, it's not on anyone else's property, and it's not impeding any drainage systems." I passed the photos to Brenda, who glanced at them briefly before passing them to the other board members. "Second," I continued, "the regulation in question states that snow should not be piled in a manner that creates visual disruption or impedes drainage. I'd argue that my snow placement does neither. The drainage area is designed for exactly this purpose, and in terms of visual disruption, the snow is barely visible from the street and is consistent with how most residents clear their driveways." Gerald leaned forward. "Mr. Anderson, the issue isn't whether the snow is functional. The issue is whether it meets our community standards for appearance. A large pile of snow in your side yard is unsightly, regardless of whether it's in a drainage area. With respect, Mr. Patterson, I've been clearing my snow this way for 3 years, and this is the first time anyone has raised a concern. If this is really about community standards, why wasn't this enforced before?" Brenda cut in. "As I explained on the phone, the board has decided to enforce this regulation more strictly. We've received complaints from residents who are concerned about the appearance of the neighborhood, and we're taking action to address those concerns." "Can you tell me who complained about my property specifically?" "That information is confidential. So I'm being fined based on anonymous complaints and a vague regulation that's being enforced selectively." The room got quiet. I could feel the tension building, but I wasn't backing down. This whole thing was absurd, and I wanted them to acknowledge it. Linda, the treasurer, spoke up. "Mr. Anderson, I understand your frustration, but the HOA has the authority to enforce its regulations as it sees fit. The fine is appropriate given the violation." "I disagree," I said. "And I'd like the board to consider rescinding the fine." The board members looked at each other, and then Brenda spoke. "We'll deliberate and notify you of our decision within 7 business days. Thank you for your time, Mr. Anderson." I gathered my materials and left the community center, feeling defeated. I'd made my case as clearly as I could, but I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't matter. The board had already made up their minds. A week later, I received the decision letter. The board had voted 4-1 to uphold the fine. Only Margaret Ellis had voted in my favor. The letter reiterated that I needed to pay the $150 within 30 days, and that future violations would result in increased penalties. I was furious. The whole process felt like a kangaroo court, designed to extract money from residents rather than actually maintain community standards. But what really got me was the hypocrisy. I'd noticed that several board members, including Brenda herself, had snow piles on their properties that were just as visible as mine. But apparently, the rules didn't apply to them. That's when I had an idea. If the HOA wanted to fine me for clearing snow the wrong way, then I simply wouldn't clear it at all. Let's see how they like that. The next snowstorm hit on a Saturday night, dumping another 14 inches on Rochester. I woke up Sunday morning, looked out my window at my buried driveway, and went back to bed. I didn't touch my snow blower. I didn't grab a shovel. I did absolutely nothing. Monday morning, I called into work and told them I couldn't get out of my driveway. It was true. My car was completely snowed in, and without clearing the driveway, there was no way I was getting to the plant. I used a vacation day. By Monday afternoon, I noticed something interesting. The mail truck drove down our street, but it didn't stop at any of the houses on my side of the block. The reason was simple. The snow from the storm had created a wall along the curb, blocking access to all the mailboxes. Normally, residents would clear the snow away from their mailboxes to ensure the Postal Service could deliver mail. But I hadn't cleared mine, and neither had several of my neighbors who apparently hadn't gotten around to it yet. Tuesday morning, Tom knocked on my door. "Hey Scott, you okay? I noticed you haven't cleared your driveway." "I'm fine," I said. "Just following HOA regulations." Since they fined me for clearing snow the wrong way, I figured the safest approach is not to clear it at all. Tom's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Completely. If the HOA wants to micromanage how I clear snow, then they can deal with the consequences when I don't clear it." "But what about your mailbox? The Postal Service won't deliver if they can't access it." "I know, but that's not my problem anymore. It's the HOA's problem." Tom laughed, shaking his head. "You're going to stir up a hornet's nest, you know that? Good. Maybe they'll think twice before issuing ridiculous fines." By Wednesday, the situation had escalated. Several residents on my street hadn't cleared the snow from their mailboxes yet, creating a domino effect. The Postal Service had suspended mail delivery to our entire block until the mailboxes were accessible. I knew this because a notice had been posted on the community message board online, with residents complaining that they weren't getting their mail. Brenda sent out an email blast to all residents, reminding them of their responsibility to maintain access to their mailboxes and warning that failure to do so could result in HOA violations. I deleted the email without responding. Thursday afternoon, Brenda showed up at my door. I watched through the window as she marched up my snow-covered walkway, her boots crunching through the ice. She knocked loudly, and I waited a full minute before opening the door. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her face red from cold and irritation. "We need to talk about your property." "What about it?" "You haven't cleared your driveway or your mailbox. The Postal Service has suspended delivery to this entire block because of inaccessible mailboxes, and you're one of the primary offenders." "I'm not violating any HOA regulations," I said calmly. "In fact, I'm being extra careful not to violate Code Section 12.4. Since I was fined for clearing snow improperly, I've decided not to clear it at all. That way, there's no risk of creating an aesthetic disruption. Brenda's eyes narrowed. This is childish, Mr. Anderson. You're causing problems for your neighbors. I'm not causing any problems. I'm simply complying with HOA regulations in the most cautious way possible. If the board wants me to clear my snow, maybe they should rescind the fine and clarify exactly how they want it done. The fine stands and you need to clear your property immediately. Or what? You'll fine me again. Go ahead. I'm not paying the first fine and I won't pay any additional ones. If you want to take me to court over this, be my guest. Brenda's face turned an even deeper shade of red. You're being unreasonable. No, Brenda. The HOA is being unreasonable. You issued a fine based on a vague regulation that you're enforcing selectively. I'm just responding in kind. She turned and stormed back to her car, nearly slipping on the ice in my walkway. I closed the door, feeling a sense of satisfaction. This was going to get messy, but I was committed now. Over the next few days, the situation in Riverside Meadows deteriorated. Several other residents, inspired by my act of defiance, also stopped clearing their snow. Some did it out of solidarity with me. Others because they were fed up with the HOA's increasingly strict enforcement of petty rules. The block of homes on Maple Drive became known as the Snow Zone, with driveways and mailboxes buried under layers of ice and snow. The Postal Service continued to suspend mail delivery, which created a cascade of problems. People weren't getting their bills, their packages were being held at the post office, and the online community message board was flooded with angry complaints. Some residents blamed me, calling me selfish and immature. Others defended me, arguing that the HOA had brought this on themselves. Brenda sent me another letter, this time threatening legal action if I didn't clear my property within 48 hours. I responded with my own letter, stating that I was in full compliance with all HOA regulations and that any legal action would be vigorously contested. I also pointed out that the HOA's own president had a visible snow pile on her property that arguably violated the same regulation I'd been fined for. That last point seemed to hit a nerve. Within a day, I noticed that Brenda had cleared the snow pile from her property and spread it more evenly across her lawn, but she still didn't rescind my fine. The standoff continued for another week. My vacation days were running out, and I'd started parking my car on a nearby public street so I could get to work. It was inconvenient, but I was determined not to back down. Every day, I'd walk past my snow-covered driveway and smile, knowing that somewhere in her perfectly decorated house, Brenda was fuming. Then, on a Friday afternoon, things took an unexpected turn. I received a phone call from a man named Richard Torres, who identified himself as an attorney representing 3 other residents in Riverside Meadows. He explained that he'd been following the situation and wanted to discuss a potential class action lawsuit against the HOA. A class action lawsuit. I said, intrigued. On what grounds? Selective enforcement of regulations, arbitrary fines, and violation of due process, Richard explained. From what I've gathered, the HOA has been issuing fines based on vague regulations without giving residents adequate opportunity to contest them. Your case is particularly egregious because the regulation in question is so poorly defined that it's essentially unenforceable. I'm listening. I'd like to meet with you and discuss your experience in detail. If we can establish a pattern of abuse by the HOA board, we may be able to sue for damages and force them to reform their practices. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. I spent the weekend documenting everything: the original fine, the appeal hearing, my correspondence with Brenda, and the subsequent threats. I also reached out to other residents who'd been fined or threatened by the HOA, gathering their stories. The meeting with Richard was eye-opening. In addition to me, 3 other residents attended. A young couple named Jake and Emily Morrison who'd been fined for having the wrong color curtains visible from the street. An elderly man named Frank Delgado who'd been threatened with fines for having a bird feeder in his front yard. And a single mother named Rachel Wu who'd been cited for parking her work van in her driveway overnight. Richard listened to each of our stories, taking detailed notes. "This is good," he said when we'd finished. "The HOA has clearly overstepped its authority. These regulations are either too vague to be enforceable, or they're being applied in a discriminatory manner. I think we have a strong case." "What's the next step?" Jake asked. "I'll draft a demand letter to the HOA board, outlining the issues and giving them an opportunity to rescind the fines and reform their practices. If they refuse, we'll file a lawsuit. In the meantime, I'd advise all of you to continue documenting any interactions with the HOA and to avoid paying any contested fines." I left the meeting feeling energized. This was bigger than just my snow removal fine. This was about holding the HOA accountable for years of petty tyranny. Richard sent the demand letter the following week. It was a masterpiece of legal writing, laying out in precise detail all the ways the HOA had violated its own rules and overstepped its authority. The letter demanded that all contested fines be rescinded, that the board issue a public apology, and that they implement reforms to prevent future abuses. The HOA's response came 10 days later. They rejected all of our demands, claiming that they had full authority to enforce the regulations as written, and that all fines had been issued appropriately. They also warned that anyone who continued to refuse payment would face liens on their properties. "That's what I expected," Richard said when I forwarded him the response. "They're not going to back down voluntarily. We'll need to take this to court." He filed the lawsuit in early March, seeking damages for all affected residents, and an injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing the contested regulations. The case was assigned to Judge Patricia Hollenbeck in Olmsted County District Court, with a preliminary hearing scheduled for mid-April. In the meantime, my personal standoff with the HOA continued. I still hadn't cleared my driveway, though by now most of the snow had started to melt. Spring was coming, and with it, the end of snow season. But the point had been made. The entire neighborhood knew about my dispute with the HOA, and opinion was divided. Some people thought I was a hero standing up to an overbearing board. Others thought I was a troublemaker making life difficult for everyone. The preliminary hearing was held on a Tuesday morning. Richard represented our group, while the HOA had hired a law firm from Minneapolis to defend them. The hearing lasted about an hour, with both sides presenting their arguments. Judge Hollenbeck listened carefully, asked a few pointed questions, and then announced that she'd issue a written decision within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt like an eternity. I kept checking the court's online docket, waiting for the decision to be posted. Finally, on a Thursday afternoon, it appeared. I downloaded the PDF and read through it eagerly. Judge Hollenbeck had ruled in our favor on several key points. She found that the snow removal regulation was unconstitutionally vague, and that the HOA had applied it in an arbitrary and discriminatory manner. She issued an injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing that particular regulation, and ordered them to rescind all related fines. She also ordered the HOA to pay our legal fees and to implement reforms to their fine and appeal processes. It was a total victory. I immediately called Richard, who was equally thrilled. "This is huge," he said. "Not only did we win on your specific case, but we've set a precedent that will make it much harder for HOAs to enforce vague regulations in the future. The decision sent shockwaves through Riverside Meadows. Brenda sent out an email to all residents, announcing the court's ruling and stating that the board would comply with the order. Her tone was stiff and formal, with no acknowledgement that the board had done anything wrong. But the fallout was just beginning. Within a week, a petition started circulating calling for the removal of the entire HOA board. Residents were fed up with Brenda's aggressive enforcement tactics and the thousands of dollars in legal fees the community had incurred defending the lawsuit. The petition gathered signatures quickly, and within a month, a special election was scheduled. I decided to run for a board position. I'd never been particularly interested in HOA politics, but I felt like I had a responsibility to help reform the organization from within. Several other reform-minded candidates also threw their hats in the ring, including Tom Brennan and Rachel Wu. The election was held in late May, and the results were decisive. Brenda, Gerald, and Linda all lost their seats. David and Margaret kept theirs, having been seen as more moderate voices on the board. Tom was elected president, I was elected vice president, and Rachel became treasurer. 2 other reform candidates filled the remaining seats. Our first order of business was to review all the HOA regulations and identify ones that were vague, overly restrictive, or unnecessary. We held a series of town halls where residents could voice their concerns and make suggestions. The process took several months, but by the end of summer, we'd streamlined the regulations significantly, cutting out dozens of petty rules and clarifying the ones that remained. We also implemented new procedures for fines and appeals, ensuring that residents had proper notice and a fair opportunity to contest any violations. The days of arbitrary fines based on aesthetic preferences were over, but the story doesn't end there. In July, something happened that brought the whole mess full circle. A resident named Patricia Simmons filed a complaint with the county attorney's office, alleging that Brenda had embezzled HOA funds during her tenure as president. Patricia had been going through the financial records as part of the board transition and discovered several irregularities: unexplained cash withdrawals, invoices for services that were never performed, and payments to companies that didn't seem to exist. The county attorney's office launched an investigation, and within weeks, they'd uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning nearly 2 years. Brenda had been siphoning money from the HOA, using it to pay for personal expenses like vacations, home renovations, and even a new car. In total, she'd stolen over $70,000. The news rocked the community. Brenda was arrested in early August and charged with theft by swindle and embezzlement. The case made headlines in the local media, with reporters describing it as one of the largest HOA fraud cases in Minnesota history. I was subpoenaed to testify at her trial, which was held in October. The prosecution laid out a detailed case, showing how Brenda had used her position as HOA president to access funds and cover her tracks. They presented bank records, invoices, and testimony from contractors who'd never done the work they'd allegedly been paid for. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecutor asked me about my interactions with Brenda and the HOA board. I described the snow removal fine, the appeal hearing, and the subsequent legal battle. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish a pattern of behavior. Brenda had been using her authority to bully residents while simultaneously stealing from the community. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding Brenda guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. The judge's comments during sentencing were scathing, describing Brenda's actions as a betrayal of trust and an abuse of power. In the months that followed, Riverside Meadows slowly returned to normal. The new board focused on transparency and accountability, making sure that residents knew how their money was being spent, and that rules were enforced fairly. We even organized a neighborhood barbecue in September, bringing everyone together to rebuild the sense of community that had been damaged by years of toxic leadership. As for me, I finally cleared my driveway that first winter after the court case. By then, it was December, and we'd gotten our first significant snowfall of the season. I fired up my snow blower and cleared the snow, piling it in the same drainage area I'd always used, and nobody said a word about it. Tom stopped by that evening watching me finish up. "Feels good, doesn't it?" He said. "What's that?" Clearing snow without worrying about getting fined. I laughed. "Yeah, it does, though I have to admit there was something satisfying about leaving it all winter and watching Brenda lose her mind. You started a revolution, you know that. If you hadn't stood up to her, we'd probably still be dealing with her nonsense. I just wanted to clear my driveway in peace. I didn't set out to take down the HOA. Sometimes the best revolutions are the accidental ones. Over the next year, I settled into my role on the HOA board. It wasn't always easy. Dealing with neighbor disputes and maintenance issues could be tedious, but it was rewarding to know that we were making the community better. We implemented a community garden, organized regular social events, and even managed to negotiate lower rates for snow removal and landscaping services. The lawsuit had exposed deeper issues beyond just Brenda's corruption. Many residents had felt voiceless and powerless under the old board, afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. Creating a more democratic and transparent HOA meant giving people confidence that their concerns would be heard and addressed fairly. Jake and Emily Morrison, the couple who'd been fined for their curtains, became some of our strongest supporters. They organized a neighborhood watch program and helped plan community events. Frank Delgado, the elderly man with the bird feeder, joined the architectural review committee and helped rewrite the guidelines to be more reasonable and clear. Rachel Wu used her financial expertise to help us develop a long-term budget plan that would fund necessary improvements without raising dues. By the following spring, Riverside Meadows felt like a completely different place. The atmosphere of fear and pettiness had been replaced by cooperation and mutual respect. People actually talked to their neighbors instead of reporting them to the HOA for minor infractions. I ran into Patricia Simmons one day at the grocery store. She was the woman who discovered Brenda's embezzlement, and I'd always been curious about what had motivated her to dig so deep into the financial records. "I had a feeling something was off," Patricia told me as we stood in the produce section. The HOA's expenses kept going up, but we weren't seeing any improvements in the community. When I took over as part of the transition team, I started asking questions. Brenda had been very careful to hide the fraud, but once you knew what to look for, the pattern was obvious. "Did you have any idea it was that bad?" "Not at first. I thought maybe there was some mismanagement or accounting errors, but the more I dug, the more I realized this was deliberate theft. She'd created fake invoices, set up shell companies, even forged signatures on checks. It was sophisticated." "I'm glad you caught it. Who knows how long it would have continued otherwise." The funny thing is, if she hadn't been so aggressive with the fines and regulations, none of this might have come to light. Your lawsuit forced a change in leadership, which led to the financial review. In a weird way, your snow pile brought down a criminal. We both laughed at that. It was true my stubborn refusal to clear my driveway had set off a chain of events that exposed corruption and reformed the HOA. All because I didn't want to pay a $150 fine. The restitution payments from Brenda came in slowly over the next few years as she worked a prison job and made arrangements to sell her house. The HOA used the recovered funds to make long overdue improvements to the community center and to build a playground that had been requested by families with young children. I served on the HOA board for 3 years before deciding to step down. By then, the reforms were well established, and a new generation of leaders had emerged who were committed to maintaining the positive changes. Tom remained president for another term before handing the reins to a younger couple who'd recently moved into the neighborhood. Looking back, the whole experience taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself and the importance of good governance. It would have been easier to just pay the fine and move on, to avoid conflict and keep my head down. But by pushing back against an unjust rule, I'd inadvertently sparked a movement that made life better for everyone in the community. The snow removal regulation that started everything was eventually replaced with a simple, clear guideline. Residents are responsible for clearing snow from their driveways, walkways, and mailbox areas in a timely manner. Snow should be placed in a location that does not block public walkways, streets, or neighboring properties. No mention of aesthetic disruption or visual appearance, just a practical rule that everyone could understand and follow. I still live in Riverside Meadows, and I've grown to genuinely love the community. The neighbors are friendly, the streets are safe, and the HOA actually functions as it should, maintaining common areas and enforcing reasonable rules without overstepping into tyranny. Every winter, when the first big snowstorm hits, I fire up my snow blower and clear my driveway, piling the snow in that same drainage area. And every time I do, I think about Brenda and her ridiculous fine, and I smile. The story became something of a legend in Rochester. People in other HOA communities heard about what happened in Riverside Meadows, and some were inspired to push back against their own overbearing boards. Richard Torres, the attorney who'd represented us, told me he'd gotten calls from residents all over Minnesota asking for help with similar issues. "You started something bigger than you realize," he said during one of our catch-up calls. HOAs all over the state are reviewing their regulations and procedures because they don't want to end up like Riverside Meadows. Your case set a precedent that's actually making a difference. That made me proud. I'd never intended to become an activist or a crusader for HOA reform. I just wanted to clear my driveway without getting fined. But sometimes, the most impactful changes come from ordinary people refusing to accept unreasonable treatment. My ex-wife Jennifer found the whole thing hilarious when I told her about it during one of our occasional phone calls. We'd maintained a cordial relationship after the divorce, and she always enjoyed hearing about my suburban adventures. "Only you could start a revolution over a snow pile," she said, laughing. "Remember when we talked about buying in an HOA community and I warned you about the potential drama?" "You did warn me," I admitted, "but I didn't think it would get this crazy." "Well, at least you made the best of it. Took down a corrupt board president and reformed the whole system. That's pretty impressive for a guy who just wanted a quiet place to live." She was right. Life in Riverside Meadows was certainly not what I'd expected when I bought my house, but it had turned into something meaningful. I'd found purpose in community service, made lasting friendships with my neighbors, and helped create positive change. The legal fees from the lawsuit and criminal case had cost the HOA nearly $100,000, money that came out of the community's reserves. It took years to rebuild those reserves, but residents were surprisingly understanding about it. Most felt that holding Brenda accountable and reforming the board was worth the cost. One unexpected benefit of the whole ordeal was that property values in Riverside Meadows actually increased. Potential buyers were attracted to a community with transparent governance and reasonable rules. Real estate agents used our reformed HOA as a selling point, emphasizing that we'd cleaned house and implemented best practices. During my last year on the board, we won an award from the Minnesota chapter of the Community Associations Institute for our governance reforms. Tom and I attended the ceremony in Minneapolis, where we accepted the award and gave a brief presentation about what we'd learned. Other HOA representatives in the audience asked thoughtful questions about how to implement similar changes in their communities. The key, Tom told them, is remembering that an HOA exists to serve the residents, not to control them. Rules should be clear, enforcement should be fair, and the board should be accountable. It sounds simple, but it's easy to lose sight of those principles. I added my perspective. Don't be afraid to question authority, even in something as mundane as a homeowners association. If a rule doesn't make sense, or if it's being enforced unfairly, speak up. And if the board won't listen, find others who feel the same way and push for change together. The award ceremony also included a segment about Brenda's criminal case, which had become a cautionary tale in the HOA management world. The presenter used it as an example of why communities need proper financial controls and oversight. Brenda's ability to embezzle so much money had been facilitated by the board's lack of transparency and the absence of independent audits. On my drive home from Minneapolis that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. 3 years earlier, I'd been a guy who just wanted to clear his driveway and get to work. Now, I was accepting awards for community governance and giving advice to other HOA leaders. Life has a funny way of taking unexpected turns. The community garden that we'd established became one of my favorite additions to the neighborhood. Residents could rent small plots to grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers, and it became a gathering place where people would chat while tending their plants. I rented a plot and grew tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini, sharing the harvest with my neighbors. Frank Delgado, the bird feeder guy, created a small nature area in one corner of the garden with native plants that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. His bird feeders were now officially recognized as a community amenity rather than a violation. Kids from the neighborhood would visit to watch the birds and learn about different species. The basketball hoop that had gotten one resident in trouble during those early days of Brenda's reign was now joined by several others, and we'd even organized a neighborhood basketball league for kids. What had once been treated as violations were now celebrated as features that made Riverside Meadows a better place to live. My work schedule had stabilized, and I'd gotten a promotion at the plant, which came with better hours and more flexibility. I was able to attend more community events and spend time with the friends I'd made through all the HOA drama. Tom and I started a tradition of meeting for coffee every Saturday morning at a local cafe, where we'd discuss everything from sports to politics to neighborhood gossip. You ever think about what would have happened if you just paid that fine? Tom asked me one Saturday. All the time, I said. Brenda would probably still be president, still stealing money, still making everyone miserable with petty fines. The whole trajectory of the community would be different. It's kind of scary when you think about it. One person's decision to stand up changed everything. Or one person's decision to issue a stupid fine changed everything. Depends on how you look at it. We both laughed. The snow removal fine had become a running joke in the neighborhood, something people brought up at parties and events. Remember when Scott stopped clearing his driveway and took down the HOA? It was funny now, though it hadn't felt funny at the time. As winter approached again, I made sure my snow blower was in good working order. I changed the oil, replaced the spark plug, and tested it to make sure it would start easily when the snow came. I was looking forward to clearing my driveway without drama, without worrying about fines or regulations or angry HOA presidents. The first snow of that season fell on a Wednesday night in November, just a few inches of light, fluffy snow. I cleared my driveway in the morning before work, piling the snow in the drainage area as always. As I was finishing up, several neighbors drove past and waved. A couple of them honked and gave me thumbs up. It was their way of acknowledging the journey we'd all been on together. Brenda was released from prison after serving 2.5 years, having earned early release for good behavior. She moved to another state to live with relatives, and as far as I know, she never returned to Rochester. Her house in Riverside Meadows had been sold to pay restitution, and a nice family with 3 kids moved in. They had no idea about the property's history, and nobody felt the need to tell them. The new HOA board continued the traditions and policies that Tom and I had helped establish. Annual meetings were well attended. Financial reports were posted online for all residents to review, and rule changes were put to community votes rather than decided unilaterally by the board. It wasn't a perfect system. There were still disputes and disagreements, but it was fair and transparent. I eventually started dating again, meeting a woman named Michelle Edwards at a community event. She was a nurse at Mayo Clinic and had recently moved to Rochester for work. When I told her about the snow removal saga, she couldn't stop laughing. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," she said. "You got fined for clearing snow wrong, I know, but it worked out in the end. I'll say, you're like the Rosa Parks of HOA reform. That might be overstating it a bit. Still, it's a great story. Most people just complain about their HOA and never do anything about it." Michelle and I grew closer over the following months, and she became part of the Riverside Meadows community. She loved the neighborhood, especially the sense of involvement and pride that residents had in making it a good place to live. We got married 2 years later in a ceremony at the community center, with half the neighborhood in attendance. The snow pile that started everything became a symbol of resistance and reform in Riverside Meadows. During one particularly snowy winter, someone erected a small plaque in the drainage area between my property and my neighbors. It read, "The snow pile that changed everything winter 2024-2025. I tried to get it removed because it seemed self-aggrandizing, but the board voted to keep it as a reminder of the community's history. Tom gave a speech at my wedding reception, telling the story of the snow removal fine and everything that followed. He talked about how one person's willingness to stand up for what's right can inspire others and create real change. It was embarrassing and touching at the same time, and by the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. To Scott," Tom said, raising his glass. "The man who saved Riverside Meadows one snow pile at a time." Everyone laughed and applauded, and I stood up to say a few words. "I appreciate all the kind words," I said. "But the truth is, I didn't do this alone. This community came together to demand better leadership and accountability." Patricia Simmons uncovered the fraud. Richard Torres provided legal expertise, and all of you supported the reforms that made this place what it is today. I just refused to clear my driveway. More laughter and applause. Michelle squeezed my hand and smiled at me, and I realized how lucky I was. What had started as one of the most frustrating experiences of my life had led to meaningful friendships, positive change, and ultimately, happiness. Years later, when people ask me about living in an HOA community, I tell them the whole story. I explain that HOAs can be a force for good when they're run properly, but they can also become tools of petty tyranny when the wrong people are in charge. The key is staying engaged, asking questions, and never being afraid to push back against unreasonable rules or unfair treatment. The snow removal regulation remains one of the simplest and most reasonable rules in Riverside Meadows. Every winter, residents clear their driveways and pile the snow wherever makes sense for their property. Nobody gets fined for aesthetic disruptions or visual problems. We all just do what needs to be done to keep our homes accessible and our mailboxes clear. And me. I still live at 42 Maple Drive, still fire up my snow blower when winter storms hit, and still pile the snow in that same drainage area. Every time I do, I think about Brenda and her $150 fine, about the lawsuit and the trial and the reforms that followed. I think about how a simple act of defiance sparked a revolution that exposed corruption and made my community a better place. It's a reminder that ordinary people have more power than they realize, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not over great principles, but over small inconveniences. A snow pile, a parking space, a bird feeder, these mundane things can become catalysts for change when people decide they've had enough. Riverside Meadows is home now, truly and completely. Not just because of the house I own or the neighbors I've gotten to know, but because of the shared experience of fighting for something better and winning. We built something together, something worth protecting and preserving. And it all started because I refused to pay a fine for clearing my snow the wrong way. Some people might say I overreacted, that I should have just paid the fine and moved on. But I don't think standing up for yourself is ever an overreaction. Brenda was wrong to issue that fine, wrong to enforce vague regulations arbitrarily, and wrong to steal from the community she was supposed to serve. By refusing to back down, I helped expose all of that. So yeah, I let the snow block the mailboxes that winter. I made life inconvenient for my neighbors for a few weeks. But in doing so, I helped create a community where people don't have to live in fear of their HOA, where rules are fair and clear, and where leaders are held accountable for their actions. That's worth a few weeks of inconvenience. The story of Riverside Meadows is ultimately a story about the power of community and the importance of standing up for what's right, even in small things. It's about how corruption can hide in the most mundane places and how ordinary people can root it out when they work together. And it's about snow piles, ridiculous fines, and the satisfying feeling of watching justice prevail. Every winter, when that first big storm rolls through Rochester and I head out to clear my driveway, I do it with a sense of pride and purpose. Not because snow removal is particularly meaningful in itself, but because of what it represents: the freedom to maintain my property in a reasonable way without fear of arbitrary punishment. That's what I fought for, and that's what we won. And if anyone ever asks me whether it was worth it, whether all the stress and conflict and legal battles were worth it just to avoid a $150 fine, I'll tell them absolutely. Because it was never really about the money. It was about principle, about fairness, about refusing to let petty tyrants use positions of minor authority to make other people's lives miserable. That's always worth fighting for. The snow melts every spring, returning year after year in the endless cycle of Minnesota winters. But the changes we made to Riverside Meadows are permanent. They'll outlast me, outlast everyone who was involved in the original fight. Future residents will benefit from the reforms we implemented, probably without ever knowing the story behind them. That's okay. The best revolutions are the ones that become so thoroughly integrated into the system that people forget there was ever anything different. So here I am, years later, living in a community I helped transform, married to an amazing woman, surrounded by friends who stood with me during the hardest parts of the fight. My snowblower sits in the garage, ready for the next storm. My mailbox is always accessible. And somewhere in Minnesota, there's a former HOA president serving out her sentence, hopefully learning that power without accountability always ends badly. This is how ordinary people change the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through stubborn refusal to accept injustice in small things. One snow pile, one fine, one lawsuit at a time. And sometimes, if you're lucky, those small acts of resistance cascade into something bigger, something that makes life better for everyone around you. That's the story of how I got fined for clearing snow the wrong way, stopped clearing it completely, and ended up reforming my HOA and exposing a corrupt president. It's messy and complicated and kind of ridiculous, but it's also proof that standing up for yourself matters, even when the stakes seem small. Especially when the stakes seem small. Because that's where tyranny starts, in the small things, the petty rules, the minor abuses of authority that people are too tired or too busy to fight against. And that's where it needs to end, with ordinary people saying no and refusing to back down until things change. I never expected to become known as the guy who took down the HOA with a snow pile, but I'll take it. It's better than being known as the guy who paid unjust fines without complaint, who let bullies get away with their behavior, who stood by while corruption flourished in his community. I'd rather be a troublemaker who made things better than a compliant resident who made things easier. And every winter, when I clear my driveway and pile the snow in that drainage area, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to go along with something wrong. That's where change begins. That's how communities improve. That's how ordinary people become heroes in their own small way. The snow falls, I clear it away, and life goes on in Riverside Meadows a little better, a little fairer, and a lot more accountable than it was before. And that's all I ever really wanted.